Despite being over 15 years old, Clannad remains one of the best known and most highly praised anime series of the 2000s, with its name guaranteed to be found on any thread that pops up about the top 10 saddest anime series or whatever. Its release more or less coincides with its production studio, Kyoto Animations, becoming synonymous with the best looking anime you've seen in your life. And even now the series feels like a breath of fresh air in the rom-com and slice of life genres, by having the balls to continue for a full season after the MC hooks up with Best Girl and they graduate, to tackle topics like moving out, living on your own, marriage, and parenthood. What you might also be aware of is that Clannad is adapted from a visual novel, a sort of computerized choose-your-own-adventure book, which was released in Japan just 3 years earlier. Visual novels, or VNs, are clearly popular in Japan, but are much less touched on in the West, except among the weebiest of circles. I'm sure plenty of people, myself included, have watched a socially unacceptable amount of anime without having ever touched or really thought much about VNs, despite plenty of popular series like Fate and Steins Gate being adapted from the medium. But Clannad's VN, likely due to the success of the anime, has become relatively socially acceptable to consume in the West, with relatively recent releases on Steam, PlayStation 4, and even Switch. But despite being a huge fan of the anime, the VN's questionable $45 price tag for a 2004 choose-your-own-adventure game made me indifferent to the anime source material, at least until a particularly aggressive Steam sale discount left me with no choice but to pick it up, whereupon I subsequently spent nearly 100 hours playing through it. Waking from my dango-induced days, I was left with a couple impressions and a single burning question. The anime had definitely changed some stuff and cut some scenes from the VN, but what exactly were the changes? There's websites out there which compile every single change frame between all 4 different versions of Apocalypse Now, so surely some nerd out there had already put together a comprehensive overview of how one of anime's most influential series was adapted. But when a 30-second Google search came up with only limp single-paragraph opinion pieces, I knew what I had to do. That my only option was to devote hundreds of hours into researching and creating a series of overly exhaustive comparison videos that no one will watch so that you too can have access to this arcane knowledge. So why bother spending all that time creating this comparison, especially among all the thousands of other anime adaptations? And what's more, why should you care? Well, there's a couple interesting questions that motivated me. The first had to do with the format of the VN and my respect for KyoAni as a studio. As mentioned, the VN, by its very medium, is structured like a digital choose-your-own-adventure book, with tons of parallel timelines and outcomes based on the player's choices. This makes KyoAni's task of adapting this jigsaw puzzle of initially disconnected events into a 2-series single-timeline connected narrative an obviously non-trivial task with no single clear answer on how to adapt it. And given how much I've enjoyed the studio's other works, and how much respect I have for many of their staff, I was curious how they chose to go about it. What did they keep? What did they ditch? What did they alter? And why? And what kept me going, what I discovered only after jumping into this insane task, was that there were a lot of subtle but significant changes, not just to the plot, but to the presentation of characters and themes that seemed to have been very thoughtfully and intentionally done. This wasn't some cheap movie adaptation throwing together a mess of a script for a beloved book and creating a narrative and thematic mess. This was an obviously competent adaptation with a clear understanding of the original work that decided to still make changes anyways. And I just had to drill into the differences as much as I could to try to identify why. For what purpose were these altercations made? But as a spoiler, if you're just a fan of either the anime or the VN and haven't checked out the other, I'd highly recommend both. Both versions are masterfully done and absolutely worth experiencing if you're a Clannad fan. Each version has its own strengths and weaknesses, but they work together as a fantastic companion piece of sorts, and I'd highly recommend anyone who's only experienced one to check the other out. Or just feel free to stick around and listen to me list out everything you missed out on. But, before we start with the comparison, let's take a step back and talk about what a VN even is for those of you who, like me, were totally unfamiliar with the genre. As I alluded to earlier, the best comparison I can make for how a VN plays to a Western audience is those scholastic choose-your-own-adventure books, except in this case, your choices don't usually result in a strange and ignominious demise. Most of your playtime is spent reading text, largely dialogue, which is supported by voice acting, music, and a paper doll-like visual system that uses static character portraits which switch between a handful of poses and expressions. There are instances where the game takes great creative liberties with the system to sell impactful moments via full-screen illustrations or other effects, but for the most part, that back and forth of dialogue and simple character images is your gameplay experience. As in the anime, Clannad the VN tells its story from the perspective of Okazuki Tomoyo, a listless high school delinquent on the cusp of graduation. But unlike the anime, it's literally presented from his point of view, with the player having access to his thoughts and internal monologues, as well as making choices from it, honestly pretty sparse intervals. But don't mistake this for some BioWare RPG. Okazuki is a distinct character with a set personality, and the choices you're given more or less all fit his character. Narratively, it feels less like arbitrarily choosing what you, as the player, want to do, and more like you're seeing a handful of options Okazuki is actively considering, and you just get to be the overriding factor selecting which option he eventually decides on. Another significant difference that the visual novel's medium brings is that the game requires multiple playthroughs to fully complete the story, each of which involves turning the clock back to reset to the start of the narrative. All your progress and choices are reset, and you're left to begin the story anew, to discover where a fresh set of choices might lead. Each playthrough sees you run through the same standard mix of beginning optional events, before the narrative eventually splits into one of multiple routes based on your earlier actions. These routes are each a unique branching story that focuses on Okazuki interacting with one of Clannad's side characters, and contain their own branching choices that can lead to optional scenes and potentially even bad endings. Each of these routes takes multiple hours to complete, and each ends with the credits rolling before booting you back to the main menu. The gameplay, if you can call it that, is save scumming and trying different options to discover the various required routes and optional content. Although Clannad shares in the grand tradition of 90s point-and-click adventure games that there's often no sane correlation between some of the choices and their actual narrative consequences, leaving the player to inevitably pull up a walkthrough after a couple failed playthroughs trying to get Kyo's route to finally start, god damn it! In total, Clannad has 10 main routes, most of which grant a ball of light upon reaching the route's good ending. Completing all routes, which means collecting a total of 8 balls of light, unlocks Afterstory, a more linear epilogue route that continues off of Nagisa's timeline. This Afterstory route contains a lot of the more interesting and maturely presented content that arguably made Clannad famous in the first place, and is something we'll dig into in a later video. Of the 10 required main routes, some are indeed about Okazuki hooking up with one of the series' many big-eyed waifus, but plenty aren't, with the main connecting element between all the routes arguably being their focus on family and familiar relationships, whether that's between parents, siblings, or newly formed couples. And this, of course, is part of what makes Clannad's adaptation process particularly interesting. Even ignoring Afterstory, to see the VN's full narrative, one has to effectively play through 10 parallel timelines which the anime has to somehow stitch into a single cohesive series of events. Something that's obviously unviable for the anime to fully adapt in only 30 or so 20-minute episodes. This is doubly true since each of these parallel timelines in the VN somewhat overlap, with the same characters, days, and events playing out totally differently depending on which route you're on. The anime, of course, presents its narrative in a much more conventional form, being made up of two 22-episode seasons which form a single narrative tracing through the content adapted from across the 10 main routes as well as Afterstory. Of course, they can't make it too simple, and the anime's second season, called Clannad Afterstory, isn't actually an adaptation of the epilogue Afterstory route like you'd expect. Instead, it continues to cover content from the base non-Afterstory routes for its first 7 episodes, only covering the content from Afterstory after episode 8, already a third of the way through its runtime. And while 44 anime episodes might seem like a lot of content, each VN route can stretch over 5 or 6 hours, plus there's Afterstory, which is a full normal route or 2 long, leaving us with a good 60 to 70 hours of content that the anime has to shove into only 16 or 17 hours of runtime. Like with most movie and anime adaptations, this means it's inevitable that a lot of content was going to be cut, and that's on top of the contradictory events that happen across different VN routes. The anime had to find some way to combine or cut down. But before we get too deep into how the anime pulled that off, let's quickly run through what each of the VN's 10 main routes cover. First, we have the main narrative the anime follows, the overriding narrative the anime usually defaults to if we have contradicting events between routes, Nagisa's arc. This was an obvious choice, given it's the only route that transitions into Afterstory, and Nagisa's clearly the poster girl for the game. In this route, Okazuki runs into a lonely girl who had to repeat her senior year due to a recurring sickness, and helps her to reform the school's drama club. This being the main route, it's the most fully adapted in the anime, but it also ends up being pretty significantly altered and chopped up, given the anime had to stuff all the other routes' contents into the middle of this one. This much should be obvious just from listing out the anime episodes which focus on adapting content from this VN route, which include episodes 1 through 4, 15 and 16, 19 through 22, before Nagisa's route is finally concluded all the way out in episode 9 of season 2. We then have 3 more routes the anime adapts more or less in their entirety, although their timelines are often a little bit messed with. These include Fuko route, which follows a starfish-obsessed girl who's kind of not really a ghost, and her quest to make sure her sister's upcoming wedding is properly celebrated. Interestingly, this route branches off midway through Nagisa's arc in the VN, meaning a lot of its early content is intertwined with hers. Her story is the first side arc to be adapted, and is covered in episodes 5 through 9. The next 5 episodes then transition into Katomi's route, where in the VN, Okazuki romances the school's resident socially awkward genius and helps her tackle her childhood trauma. Also getting a 5-episode adaptation, Katomi's route follows up Fuko's in episode 10 through 14 of the anime. And the final route that's more or less fully adapted is Mei's route, which focuses on the Sunahara siblings as both the relationship and Okazuki's friendship with Sunahara is tested. This route is covered in episodes 2 through 4 of Afterstory. Next up, we have 2 routes that have most of their big moments adapted, but the anime rushes through them or otherwise cuts out significant parts in order to fit them into its overarching narrative. First up is an interesting case in Yukini arc, in which Okazuki kind of just hangs out with the reference room librarian and her delinquent friends until they kiss and the route ends. And I'm not exaggerating. Much of the conflict as well as the conclusion to this arc in the anime actually isn't from the VN. Most of the memorable moments from the VN route is sprinkled throughout episodes 17 and 18, before the anime kind of just creates its own arc in episodes 7 and 8 of Afterstory to give her character's route a conclusion. Next in this category is Misei route, in which VN Okazuki suddenly transforms into a cougar hunter and attempts to seduce the dorm mother at Sunahara's dorm, before the route turns into a flashback from her high school lover who's also a cat. This content, minus the MILF hunting, is adapted in episode 5 and 6 of Afterstory. We then have two routes in which only some important scenes remain adapted, and they're so split up it's hard to call it a proper arc in the anime. This includes Tomoyo route, in which Tomoyo dates a super ambitious girl whose name is confusingly similar to his own, before they run into issues due to making out too much. Content from this route, not including the making out unfortunately, is adapted in episodes 17 through 18 of the anime. It's a weird one, but I also put Komura arc in this category. Komura's route is a weirdly short one, and it branches off of Nagisa's bad ending. It focuses on Okazuki's retiring teacher who previously put him and Sunahara on the right path. Some of this route's major content is integrated into episode 9 of Afterstory. And finally, we have Poor Kyo route, which is basically entirely unadapted except for a few early moments. This is pretty clearly due to its heavy focus on relationship melodrama, as Tomoyo attempts to two-time the twins. There's also technically a parallel Ryo ending in the VN if you're into short hair more, but because the VN hates Ryo, it actually isn't required to unlock Afterstory. What tiny content the anime pulls from this route is covered in episodes 17 through 18. And, I guess for the sake of completeness, I do have the dishonor of mentioning the Kappai route, which does technically exist and is required to unlock Afterstory, but is so cursed the anime correctly chose to scrub literally all mention of its existence, a morally correct decision that I will also uphold in this review. As for the episodes in this chart not yet filled out, those cover content from the VN's Afterstory route, which we'll talk about at a later date. As this quick rundown shows, there's a lot of routes the anime attempts to adapt in very few episodes. Along with the main series episodes, there are also 5 OVAs released with the series, 2 with the first season, 2 with Afterstory, and 1 boring summary episode released at the end of Afterstory. 2 of these OVAs show some pity to the losers of the adaptation bracket, and give even more rushed single-episode adaptations of Tomoyo and Kyo route respectively. These episodes are totally separate from the anime's main timeline, actually being more true to the VN's parallel route presentation. Another OVA focuses on some minor prequel events taken from Clannad side stories, and actually non-interactable follow-up to Clannad focus on some small, well, side stories. Although maybe it was the other way around given side stories released after the anime in 2010? Either way, none of these episodes are really relevant to our discussion, and the only one I'll bring up during the later comparison is Clannad's first OVA, which adapts some content from Nagisa arc that was cut during the series' normal runtime. There is also a lot of miscellaneous content the anime adapts from early on in the VN, known as Common Route, when you're still making choices and hanging out with different characters, but aren't necessarily locked into a single route yet, as well as some of the non-required endings like the famous baseball route. But that's enough summary for now, let's start diving in. We'll be following along with the anime's timeline, with this video covering from the start of the anime to when it first branches off from Nagisa's route. Following this, I'll release further videos breaking down each route the anime adapts, although that format might have to be altered with the anime's later episodes that begin mixing content from multiple routes together more finely. But for now, the beginning. Our first scene in the VN is a clip of the illusionary world, a flash forward to near the end of Afterstory with a mysterious girl buried in snow. The illusionary world is a parallel, fantastic narrative to Nagisa's events that's occasionally cut to in both versions, following a robot and a mysterious girl in a dead, empty world. Weirdly, since this narrative is only relevant to Nagisa's route, the cutaways ignominiously just stop occurring with their narrative unresolved if you lock into another character's route in the VN. We'll be better introduced to the illusionary world in both versions later, and since the anime skips this flash forward altogether, I'll not go into too much detail. Although interestingly, the anime doesn't drop it entirely, since this moment is actually the first scene of the first season's OP. Clannad's OP is actually filled with a ton of in-series content that won't be recognized by a first-time viewer, most notably Ushio running through the flowers as the title card appears, as well as Fuko meeting Otherworld Ushio, which is literally the last scene of the anime. The VN also contains some crazy in-game foreshadowing throughout its early routes, so maybe it was just the anime's way of trying to one-up it. Either way, our proper introduction into the story is Tomoyo, our main character, monologuing as he walks lackadaisically to school. The VN takes an additional moment here to highlight how no one else is around. Tomoyo's running late to school, a seemingly common occurrence, and he doesn't really seem to care. In both versions, Okazuki's monologue introduces the theme of change, wondering to himself whether anything in his life will change if he continues to live this way. The VN has an additional, seemingly odd tangent here, where Tomoyo considers how nice it'd be if the nearby hill was flattened so he could walk directly to school instead of having to take the long way around. This line is some crazy foreshadowing to events that occur in Afterstory, and it presents a concrete baseline of Tomoyo's perspective relative to the theme of change at the start of the narrative, which is something we can compare against later by observing his demeanor when this concept returns in Afterstory, assuming you even remember this comment by that point, that is. He then runs into a fellow student running late, Nagisa, who is standing frozen at the bottom of the hill, talking to herself. The VN punctuates this meeting with its first full-screen cutaway image. Unlike the other characters, Okazuki doesn't have a character portrait that appears when he speaks, so this is literally the first person we see by the start of the game. The anime takes this concept and punches it up a notch, by having the world around Tomoyo start off desaturated, showing flashes of color as he watches Nagisa, before finally bursting to life when he begins speaking to her. And this is where things immediately diverge. In general, the VN progresses literally day by day, even tracking the current calendar date at the top of the screen, while the anime trims the fat and rushes through things, adding connecting fabric to logically string together events in succession. Often these events were originally independent occurrences over the course of a couple otherwise unremarkable days in the VN. There's also a lot of reshuffling in the anime, which isn't really a huge change since many of the early moments in the VN can also occur on different days, or even be skipped over entirely depending on your choices. And nothing highlights this pacing difference more than how Clannad's first day in the VN begins, by ending. After meeting Nagisa on his way to school, Tomoyo lazes through classes with nothing to do, and has no further actions with any named characters. This slow pacing might seem overkill, but it does set a status quo for Tomoyo's stagnant life that the anime mostly misses out on by rushing ahead at such a breakneck pace. We then highlight another significant structural change, as Tomoyo goes on another long monologue about his home life, how his mom's dead and his dad's a drunk who Tomoyo avoids by staying out late. The anime skips this monologue and doesn't reveal this information until later, partially because a long internal monologue doesn't really work as well in the anime's format, and partially because I think it wants to save the impact of revealing Tomoyo's shitty home life until after we've actually gotten to know him a bit. However, this monologue does introduce a really unique characterizing detail that the anime almost entirely ignores, which is that Okazuki's avoidance of home is what causes him to chronically oversleep and to be late to school, which is in turn what's caused him to become labeled as a delinquent and to become outcast at school. But that's not to say having this huge info dump here isn't a little overkill, as he also goes into Sunohara's backstory as part of this monologue, which is totally unnecessary as it'll all be introduced to us later on anyways. Speaking of Suno, we finally get our introduction to his character, and this is also where the anime's plot rejoins the VN. After Nagisa's introduction in the anime, we get hit with the OP, then skip over to Okazuki skipping through school to arrive here, in the jock dorms, with Sunohara being bullied by the rugby club for being too loud. The anime also takes some elements from a later scene in the VN here, that being the introduction of Misei, the dorm mother, as well as her tendency of using violence against the jocks and Sunohara alike, behavior that's readily encouraged by Okazuki. And we get another tiny sign here of the anime's crazy planning, with a cute little cat lazing around Sunohara's room. We'll occasionally see Okazuki playing with this cat during his frequent visits to the dorm, and it's a detail that's surprisingly not present in the VN. It's a neat addition, and helps subtly introduce a key furry character to Misai's route that will become relevant many episodes later. In either case, Sunohara and Okazuki BS some, with the VN adding an additional segment before Tomoyo returns home, where you're given your first, albeit inconsequential, choice, deciding if you want to record over Sunohara's mixtape or not. We then get our first introduction to the illusionary world in the anime, in a scene that takes place basically identically in the VN, just slightly later on. In both cases, the sequence plays out from the point of view of a spirit, viewing a bleak, ended world, watching a young girl who can apparently see them, and deciding if they want to be born into this sad world or not. The next morning, Okazuki once again runs into Nagisa at the base of the hill. Interestingly, this encounter is skipped in the anime, and it's something the anime loses out on. Okazuki and Nagisa's relationship is much more of a slow burn in the VN, ramping up with daily short encounters at the base of the hill or at lunch, before they really start hanging out full time. Nagisa, who hasn't even been introduced to Tomoyo yet, is clearly waiting for him, unable to gather the courage to go to school on her own. Okazuki scolds her, but lets her follow along. This is one of many moments of the VN that really drives home Nagisa's discomfort as a loner, in a way the anime really never has time for, and adds a neat extra dimension to her character. The anime once again syncs back up as Okazuki returns to class, with the introduction of Ro, the meek class president, as she confronts Okazuki about the missing handouts, as well as his habit of being late. Okazuki's dismissiveness makes Ryo obviously upset, and you're given the choice to apologize or ignore her, a seemingly minor choice that weirdly determines a lot of the following events of the VN. In the anime, this is preceded by a quick added scene of Okazuki's classmates gossiping about him before he arrives, filling us in on some of his delinquent past that we were introduced to earlier in the VN's monologue. As we'll continue to see, anime Okazuki is much nicer than his VN counterpart, and he chooses the apologize option without much hesitation. Like in the VN, this decision leads to Ryo telling Okazuki's fortune. In the VN, she does this more or less normally, while in the anime she drops her cards in an apparent alternate fortune-telling technique, something that also happens in a later encounter in the VN. Her fortune's also more similar to the second fortune she gives to Okazuki in the VN, predicting that Okazuki will have an encounter with a girl, obviously referring to Nagisa, while in the VN she predicts he'll be late to school tomorrow, which leads into a tiny side arc where you can try to beat fate by ignoring an old lady looking to cross the road. Kyo shows up here in the anime to briefly get introduced, while the VN skips over her for now. Instead, it gives you your first opportunity to cut class. This is one of many options that leads Okazuki to the library to meet Kotomi and kick off her arc. Additionally, if you ignore Ryo, Suzuhara shows up half asleep and you have the option to troll him into answering the teacher's questions by singing song lyrics here. Following class, we get a scene in the anime that's taken almost word for word from later in the VN, where Okazuki overhears his classmates conversing about ghostly rumors, obviously setting up Fuko's introduction. This is followed up in the anime by Okazuki seeing Nagisa eating lunch alone in the courtyard and going down to join her. The VN has some additional content here, where Okazuki goes to the cafeteria with Sunahara, a place we see a lot early on in the VN, but barely at all in the anime, which is a literal sea of human activity. Oh yeah, and I forgot to mention it, but a lot of the characters are legitimately assholes in the VN, with Sunahara bullying underclassmen out of their seats here, before receiving quick karma from a nearby rugby player. Okazuki leaves alone, before running into a couple girls in the hallway gossiping about Nagisa eating alone, which is where you're given the choice to go down and check in on her. In either case, Nagisa makes the Sigma move to straight up ignore Okazuki and tell him to stop talking to her until she's done eating. In both versions, Nagisa again asks Okazuki if he likes this school, before going into her backstory of enjoying school until she had to repeat a year. Most of the clubs are now full, and her fellow third-years are too busy studying to make new friends. Okazuki convinces her to try the drama club, and they part ways, with Okazuki hearing the sound of approaching motorcycles as he returns to class. The anime streamlines things and has Okazuki and Nagisa instead run over to the sound of motorcycles in the middle of their conversation, with Okazuki comfortably plopping himself on top of Sunahara's head instead of just watching from class. This is Tomoyo's introduction, and she walks out to confront the hooligans. If you're familiar with VN Okazuki, this is another striking example of how different anime Okazuki is, as he actively prepares to help Tomoyo fight off the attackers before being stopped by her fangirls, compared to the VN where he just watches and at best finds the whole situation an interesting distraction. This change makes Okazuki appear less misanthropic, but ironically is also one of a couple added scenes that makes anime Okazuki seem much more comfortable throwing hands than his VN counterpart. For better or for worse, throughout this early VN content, Tomoyo is characterized as much more depressed and detached from society than his anime counterpart, with a lot of his early decisions seemingly centered around just finding ways to distract himself. Okazuki preparing to help Tomoyo is just a small change, but it's one of many that makes his anime version a much more active character, as well as coming off as just more mentally and socially better off than his VN original, even here at the start of the story. By either way, Okazuki's help obviously wasn't needed, as Tomoyo wastes the writers in a blink of an eye with some dope animation on the part of KyoAni. In the VN, this leads into a short sequence where Tomoyo and Sunahara go down to inspect the scene, where Tomoyo, surrounded by a squad of first-year fangirls, forces the hooligans to tell a teacher that it definitely wasn't her fault. The anime instead returns to Okazuki and Nagisa conversing in the courtyard, smartly tying Tomoyo's introduction into Nagisa's worries by commenting on how Tomoyo already seems to fit in, despite being a transfer student and thus in a similar situation to Nagisa. In a tiny change, the anime also has them exchange names here, before they part ways. The VN follows this up with Okazuki and Sunahara hitting the cafeteria after school, with Sunahara again being a legitimate ass instead of just a goofball, by threatening a younger student for vending machine money before Tomoyo ditches to go check on Nagisa at the theater club. The anime instead pulls in the first of Sunahara's 3 combat encounters with Tomoyo before school ends, another event that happens slightly later on in the VN. In either case, Sunahara can't believe that a woman can be weaker than a man, so he suspects the fight must have been staged, and that Tomoyo bribed the bike riders. Interestingly, for all its other family-friendly changes, the anime does actually keep Suno suggesting that Tomoyo bribed them with sexual favors, although it's phrased much less explicitly compared to in the VN. In either case, Sunahara gets his ass kicked, something that causes Okazuki to recall rumors of a beautiful female brawler in their town who was known to roam the streets and beat up bullies. Afterwards in the anime, we transition to Okazuki kinda just wandering up the stairs and running into Nagisa at the theater club door. It's a little odd, as unlike the VN, we don't get the impression that he was worried about her and checking in. It's more like he just stumbled onto her. In either case, our stories have realigned here at the theater club's door. In both cases, Okazuki sees Nagisa bribe herself with food before opening the door and finding nothing. Okazuki rushes over and sees the abandoned room, placing a hand on Nagisa's head to comfort her as he remembers that the theater club had been disbanded the prior year. In the VN, this is also where they first swap names. They then part in the VN, with Okazuki warning Nagisa to stop waiting for him and being late to school, while in the anime they hang out a while longer, with an added scene of them talking and chilling on the lawn, with Ryo walking by and doing a little freak-out seeing Okazuki hanging out with another girl. Side note, but the anime kills it in terms of mixing up the locations. The VN does a lot with what it has, but it's ultimately limited to a small set of character portraits and static backgrounds. Kyoto Animation, in classic fashion, went the extra mile and changed the school and parts of the town to locations inspired by actual places in Japan, which adds a ton of personality to the previously generic locations. There's also a great example of mixing up the scenery to increase visual interest, by having Okazuki and Nagisa talk as they chill on the grass outside, with students filtering out, instead of just staying in the hallway for the entire conversation. There's also where the anime jumps way ahead in Nagisa's arc, so let's follow along with the VN series of events for a while. After parting with Nagisa, Okazuki returns to Sunahara's dorm, and we meet Misai for the first time, mirroring her introduction in the anime. In the VN, you're given the choice to talk to her, in which case Okazuki recommends she use more violent techniques against Suno and other jocks. As they spend their evening BSing together, Suno first introduces his suspicion Tomoyo staged the earlier fight, and as before, he plans to investigate. As the day ends, we get our first proper introduction to the illusionary world in the VN, which covers the same content I previously mentioned in the anime. The next day in the VN, we get Ryo's second attempt at fortune-telling, at least assuming you apologized to her way back when, which as previously mentioned the anime already took inspiration from in its first fortune-telling encounter. This is where she drops her cards and gives a fortune that's more or less referring to Nagisa. This is also where we get Kyo's introduction in the VN, with her commenting on how Okazuki showing up on time is as rare as seeing a UFO. This is another of many details in the VN that actually makes Tomoyo feel like a delinquent, compared to the anime which skips over him repeatedly skipping class and ignoring teachers. This is also where Tsunohara first challenges Tomoyo in the VN, which plays out similarly to the anime except for an extended sequence where they first try to track down which class she's in. The VN also gets creative with its limited effects here, and literally PowerPoint transition throws Tsunohara out of the frame. If you ignored Ryo way back when, there's also an additional conversation Okazuki has with Nagisa about how much she wants the cafeteria's cutlet sandwich, but it's always sold out by the time she gets to the front of the line. You're then given the option to rush to the cafeteria at lunchtime and attempt to get it for her. Regardless of your choices, Okazuki dives into the human sea in the cafeteria and gets some form of rare sandwich for Nagisa, giving it to her before he realizes he forgot to buy one for himself, causing Nagisa to derpily wait at the end of the super long line to get one for him. This leads into Nagisa and Okazuki once again sharing lunch in the courtyard. A really nice recurring scene I'm sad the anime really never has time to set up before it dives into the route's main content. Okazuki explains to Nagisa that he's a delinquent. Nagisa asks if he's the kind of delinquent that smokes, with her explaining she's happy when he replies to the negative. In a comment that kind of foreshadows Akio's introduction, she mentions that her dad smokes and that she hates the smell of it. Okazuki then sees a couple girls watching them, and tries to convince Nagisa to wave at them, something that was adopted in their earlier conversation in the anime. The VN takes it up a step though and has Okazuki literally pick up Nagisa's arm to wave at them when she hesitates. Nagisa then decides to recreate the drama club, with her wanting Okazuki to be president, but he shoots her down and only volunteers to help. And then we're back to fighting Tomoyo in the VN, before Okazuki returns to the drama club where he and Nagisa help clean it up. Nagisa also drops some pretty unsubtle hints that she's into Okazuki, saying that she's really excited to see him. As mentioned, the VN's depiction of Nagisa is lonelier and arguably more desperate than in the anime. Taking a moment to be potentially overly critical of the VN, her interactions with Okazuki also feel a lot more like wish fulfillment, as she instantly and obviously begins crushing on him from the moment they meet. The anime dials this way back and has her acting a little more like an actual person throughout this route, although by doing so it does undercut just how lonely her situation initially was before she met Okazuki. And as they depart school, we finally rejoin the anime's narrative, with a series of events leading to Okazuki visiting Nagisa's house for dinner. However, the setup is a little different between the versions. The anime version feels a little more natural, but the VN's version ties into Okazuki's character well. In the VN, Okazuki mentions he's hungry and tries to recruit Nagisa to go eat out with him. Nagisa insists she has to get home to help her parents with dinner, and then asks Okazuki if he doesn't have to get home and eat with his parents. This leads to a downer moment as Okazuki vaguely explains his living situation. Nagisa, in an attempt to cheer him up, invites him over for dinner, and then, in another over-the-top airheaded moment, immediately ditches him to buy ingredients. There's nothing Okazuki wants to do less than to invite himself over to Nagisa's house without her even there, but the thought of what she might do if he didn't show up forces him to venture into the Furukawa household. In the anime, Nagisa instead just generally invites Okazuki to stop by her place anytime, and we cut to a montage of Okazuki bumming around town. Notably, we still haven't been introduced to Okazuki's living situation in the anime yet, but these scenes efficiently communicate Okazuki's daily routine of bumming around after school, which was introduced earlier in the VN. At some point in the anime, Okazuki just kind of finds himself in front of the Furukawa bakery, and remembering Nagisa's offer, once again proves himself a much more active character than his VN counterpart and willingly steps in. In either case, this leads to Okazuki being introduced to the Furukawa family, overwhelmed that such a close-knit and upbeat family can exist. He leaves, and this is where the anime finally hits us with Tomoyo's living condition, as he arrives home to find his father in a drunken stupor. In the anime's order of events, this reveal acts like a gut punch, revealing to us why Okazuki has been spending so much time away from home, as well as providing a stark contrast against Nagisa's happy, if eccentric, family. Either way, his father awakes, and in a moment that loses a ton of context due to my weeb level not being high enough to understand honorifics beyond a basic level, treats him kindly but distantly, which is too much for Okazuki, and he leaves the house, aimlessly running into the night. When he stops, he finds himself once again in front of the Furukawa bakery, but this time Nagisa is outside, bathed in an ethereal light as she practices lines for her play. In both versions, Okazuki is impressed by her performance, but in the VN he's a dick about it and lies and disses Nagisa instead, but they do get some good banter out of it. That's more or less where it ends in the anime, but in the VN, Nagisa snipes Okazuki, and hits the nail on the head by identifying that his bad relationship with his father is what drives him to stay out late and subsequently oversleep and arrive late for school, identifying that his delinquent persona isn't something he necessarily intentionally developed. Okazuki lies and says it isn't true, but Nagisa actually offers to let him stay over at her place in order to help mend his relationship with his father, something Okazuki ultimately turns down regardless of your choice, but it does set up her later offer when she sees Okazuki's relationship with his father firsthand. Following this, we also get a quick extra scene in the VN, where Okazuki once again returns to Tsunohara's dorm and we learn about Tsunohara's suspicion that Tomoyo is actually a man, since clearly no girl could beat him up in a fight. In either case, as Okazuki returns to school, he gets roadkilled by a certain purple-haired sadist. The VN drops some additional hints foreshadowing Kyo's bike when she first shows up in the classroom, as well as continuing the opportunity to get roadkilled by it a couple more times if you route correctly. It's also worth noting that, like Tsunohara, Kyo is legitimately more heartless in the VN, at one point admitting she is intentionally trying to run over Okazuki. Surviving the vehicular manslaughter event, Okazuki then arrives at the foot of the hill, where he again meets Nagisa, who asks if they can't walk to school together. Like every other meeting after the first, this is cut in the anime. We then get Tsunohara messing with Tomoyo again, 3 times in a row in the VN. As a fun Easter egg, if you've already beaten the game once, Tsunohara's face gets literally dented in with each kick, before finally being reduced to a censored mess. The anime cuts a couple of these encounters and spreads them out a bit more. In both versions, following Tsunohara and Tomoyo's final confrontation, she asks Okazuki why Tsuno keeps doing this, and appears legitimately deflated upon hearing the explanation, explaining that she wanted to fit in as an average girl at the school. The VN takes it further, and Tomoyo actually runs off with Okazuki and basically asks him to grope her in order to confirm to Tsuno that she is indeed a girl. Okazuki doesn't particularly care to participate, they flirt a bit, then he pinches her cheek and reports to Tsunohara that they're indeed real. The anime then catches up on some more optional common route occurrences from the VN, with Okazuki hearing another ghost rumor that is clearly about Fuko, as well as wandering into the library, where he runs into Kotomi for the first time. I'll talk about this scene further when I go into her route, but the anime connects it really well by having Okazuki wonder if she's who the ghostly rumors are referring to, before Ryo reveals her identity as the school's genius. Information that's held back until later on in her route in the VN. The VN instead has another cut lunchtime meeting between Okazuki and Nagisa here, after Okazuki ditches Tsunohara by tripping him and allowing him to be swallowed by the lunch rush, of course. Not a ton goes on. Okazuki calls Nagisa cute, and they flirt and compliment each other. It was only on the rewatch that I did for this comparison that I noticed how much the anime compresses these initial events, with its narrative jumping headfirst into reforming the drama club, with Okazuki and Nagisa only having known each other for like a day. Given the shorter total runtime of the anime, I understand why they made this change, but considering that Tomoyo and Nagisa's relationship is core to the anime's narrative, it feels a little unnatural that this early bonding is skipped over in favor of speedrunning plot points. The next couple of events play out similarly in both versions, except for their order being shuffled around. In the VN, Nagisa and Okazuki head to the club room after lunch, where they bond over their shared terrible art skills and art class experiences, before eventually making the dango-covered recruitment poster. In the anime, Okazuki instead just runs into Nagisa sitting listlessly in the courtyard with a broom, having been ditched on cleaning duty by her classmates, which leads into them heading to the club room and designing the posters. Interestingly, Nagisa is the one who comes to the decision to add illustrations to the recruitment poster in the anime, while in the VN it's Okazuki's suggestion, although he certainly wasn't expecting it to be plastered in dangos. The anime also throws a quick line about how recruitment should start after the Founders Festival. At the time, I imagine this must have been a surprising comment to VN players watching the anime for the first time, since in the VN, the concept of the Founders Festival isn't even introduced yet, and it's later revealed to be Nagisa's one chance to put on a play. I assume this line was placed here to assure VN players that the Founders Festival isn't a hard deadline like it is in the VN, given the timeline shenanigans the anime is about to start pulling in order to fit multiple routes into a single timeline. Nagisa also explains her habit of bribing herself with food when faced with challenging decisions here in the anime, something that was explained earlier in the VN, and that she generally does more frequently than in the anime. They then go to hang up the posters. In the VN, the prior discussion actually happens during lunch, with Okazuki returning to class after they finalize the poster design. But upon returning to the club room after school, he finds Nagisa missing, before seeing her sitting alone in the courtyard, like how he originally encountered her in the anime. You also have the option to look in an adjacent classroom for Nagisa in the VN, which leads into the introduction of Clannad's favorite starfish gremlin Fuko. Fuko's hard at work clumsily carving starfish, and in a move that seems much more appropriate for his anime counterpart, Okazuki steps in and takes her carving knife before she can hurt herself further. In the anime, Okazuki instead just kind of wanders into Fuko's classroom after apparently splitting up from Nagisa in order to place posters. I was also surprised in my rewatch by just how many of these scenes in the anime just cold start with Okazuki randomly stumbling into them. Given how well the anime connects elements from disparate arcs, it's weird how unrelated a lot of these events are, given that the VN generally provides a pretty simple explanation for setting them up. For example, in this case, having Okazuki run into Fuko because he's looking for Nagisa. We also get an added scene in the anime here where Tsunohara confronts Okazuki about putting up drama club posters, and goes into a big spiel about how surprised he is since Okazuki obviously hates clubs. Nagisa, of course, overhears it all. In the VN, this reveal and speech by Tsunohara happens later, with Nagisa herself spilling the beans about Okazuki helping the drama club, but having Tsuno instead see Okazuki putting up the posters is an arguably smoother transition. In both cases, we then return to sad Nagisa, with Okazuki offering to get her a big dango family to cheer her up. Although in the anime, so much has happened since Okazuki first saw Nagisa sadly sitting alone, the context is kind of lost. In the VN, they actually check out the store first, but either way, Okazuki ends up hand-making some to cheer Nagisa up. As a side note, I'm still not sure what sort of physical product the dango daikazoku are supposed to be. Are they just normal edible dango with faces drawn on them? Or are they some sort of small plush or figure? It seems like it's supposed to be the former, but wouldn't that make eating them kind of morbid? Regardless, Okazuki's father offers to help, but Okazuki isn't having any of it and does what he does best and runs off into the night, before finding Nagisa in front of her house. He delivers the dango and they talk, with Nagisa revealing she was bullied by other girls who ditched her on cleaning duty. In the VN, Okazuki asks Nagisa to find him if she feels like crying again, while in the anime this conversation plays double duty and is combined with a later conversation where Okazuki goes into his and Tsunohara's backstory and why he isn't involved with any clubs. In the VN, Nagisa's parents then come out and invite him to stay over again, but Okazuki refuses, and we get another sequence in the illusionary world introducing the mysterious girl. The anime has skipped over another day's worth of content at this point, as the conversation about Nagisa's bullying and Okazuki's club involvement were initially two separate conversations separated by about a day. Given they're pretty similar in tone, I wouldn't say it was a bad decision to combine them, but let's take a moment to cover what has occurred in the VN since that skipped day or so. First off is a nice payoff of Nagisa continually waiting for Okazuki at the foot of the hill, as we see Okazuki finally making a change for the better, and leaving for school on time so that he doesn't cause Nagisa to end up late waiting for him. He's surprised to see the path to school now full of students, and almost leaves for home when he recognizes how alone and ignored he is, as all the other students chat and laugh with their friends, before Nagisa shows up. They play some being late to school chicken before barely arriving on time. Again, I feel like the VN does a better job characterizing Nagisa and Okazuki as loners, which makes their relationship feel a lot more special and meaningful. They're two loners ostracized from the rest of the school due to their circumstances, who come together to support each other. We then get Tsunohara's next harebrained scheme to best Tomoyo, something adapted slightly later in the anime, where he attempts to seduce Tomoyo using Okazuki's advice, which of course ends up embarrassing him. Arguably it's even worse in the VN since he does it in front of Tomoyo's entire class, instead of just in an empty hallway. Tomoyo follows it up by air juggling him, something that gains the admiration of a judo club member in the VN, which sets up their later recruitment attempt. We then get Nagisa practicing for the info session. Kyo then drops by Okazuki's classroom and Shio and Okazuki mercilessly bully Tsunohara, before Tsunohara tries his hand at Ryo's fortune-telling and Kyo attempts to flirt with Tomoyo, asking him if there's anyone he likes. This is then followed by a teacher trying to recruit Okazuki to find Tsuno for his home visit, resulting in Okazuki ditching class to find him. This obviously sets up Okazuki's later home visit and is a nice detail in the VN that isn't adapted. While in the hallway, Okazuki is molested by Fuko looking for a carving knife, which he returns. A similar sequence happens in the anime a little later while Okazuki and Nagisa are eating lunch. You can also check in on Fuko afterwards in her classroom, where Okazuki notes how diligently she's carving, and some shenanigans happen. There's also the option to look for a room to take a nap in, which leads to Tomoyo going to the rec room and being introduced to Yukine, the rec room's guardian and giver of coffee. We then can get a scene of Tomoyo being harassed by the judo club captains trying to recruit her into the judo club, but Okazuki is able to scare them off. This event can lead into Tomoyo route, but I bring it up here since the anime does adapt it much later. In this playthrough at least though, we're locked into Nagisa route, so Okazuki just briefly talks to her before ditching her to go to the drama club and help Nagisa practice some more mock questions. And after all that, we're finally at the VN's version of Tsunohara finding out about the drama club. Okazuki and Nagisa are heading home after school, and who should be there at the front gate but Tsunohara? VN Okazuki is way more self-conscious of Tsuno finding out about him hanging out with Nagisa, so you're given two cringeworthy options to either pretend you don't know Nagisa, or to grab her hand and try to rush past him, which just results in Nagisa tripping and scraping her knee. Either way results in a humorous misunderstanding, where Tsuno tries his bullying shtick on Nagisa to force her to buy him a drink, while Nagisa happily goes along with it, interpreting it as a favor for someone who's clearly Okazuki's friend. She then spills the beans about Okazuki helping the drama club, leading to Tsuno reminding Okazuki that he hates clubs and whatnot. We then get the second of the two conversations with the anime combined earlier, with Okazuki explaining he came to the school on a sports scholarship like Tsunohara, but had to drop out soon after starting school for personal reasons. As a side note, the VN makes it more clear that this is why Okazuki and Tsunohara stand out from the rest of the students. The high school they go to is a relatively prestigious prep school Tsuno and Okazuki only got into due to their sports background, something they now don't even have. In the VN, Nagisa expresses she wants to pay Okazuki back for the help he's given her in some way, while in the anime she instead jumps straight to proposing they play some basketball the next day. In the VN, she instead comes up with this idea the next morning as they walk to school, much more explicitly framing it as her way of paying Okazuki back compared to in the anime. In the VN, Okazuki tries to turn her down, but in VN Nagisa's infinite absent-mindedness, she ignores his many rejections and charges ahead with the idea, while the anime again makes the exchange much more believable by instead just not giving Okazuki a good opportunity to refuse her. The setup for how Okazuki meets, or rather fails to meet Nagisa at the basketball court, differs between mediums as well. In the VN, Nagisa introduces the idea on their way to school. A full day plays out, then VN Okazuki does what he does best, by just leaving for Tsuno's dorm despite seeing Nagisa waiting for him at the outdoor court. He only returns once rain begins to pour and he becomes overcome with worry that Nagisa is still waiting for him. In the anime, Okazuki is much less intentionally mean, since in the anime continuity, Nagisa mentioned the idea the night before, and when the next day brings a torrential downpour, Okazuki just decides to ditch school entirely and chill with Tsunohara, before he similarly makes the realization Nagisa might be waiting for him anyways. Either way, Okazuki makes his way to the school building to find Nagisa waiting for him, soaked to the bone but afraid to leave just in case Tomoyo showed up and missed her. You might be asking yourself if V and Okazuki feels bad about intentionally ditching her after she admits this, to which I answer, of course he doesn't. As a side note, this is also where anime Nagisa finally admits her motivation for setting this up, that she's looking for a way to repay Tomoyo's help. They can't play a game in the rain, but Nagisa requests to see a proper basketball shot out of Okazuki. He complies, setting up a shot before the ball falls to the ground, and he explains how he previously got into a physical altercation with his father, resulting in his arm being permanently injured, preventing him from ever shooting normally and being forced to leave the team. This is presented much more dramatically in the anime, with Tomoyo falling to his knees in the rain, while in the VN he seems more controlled, bitter but consigned to what happened. Learning that her attempt to pay back Tomoyo only led to reopening old wounds, Nagisa takes psychic damage and straight up faints in the anime. In the VN she just kind of breaks down and Okazuki pulls a VN Okazuki by just ditching her in the rain as she cries. This is followed up by a bunch of VN exclusive BS, but to go into that we'll have to flash back in the VN and cover the prior events of that school day. After arriving at school and splitting up with Nagisa, we get a VN-only continuation of the Sunahara vs. Tomoyo duel, where Okazuki, at Tomoyo's prior request, manages to convince Sunahara to just drop it, man. We then get the reveal of Botan, with Okazuki seeing something rustling in the bushes by the school entrance, and then rushing down after class to investigate. This also happens a little later in the anime. In either case, Sunahara shows up and discusses eating the baby boar, leading to Kyo committing to what only can be described as attempted murder, before explaining that the little boar is her pet. This is more or less where the anime adaptation ends, but the VN adds an extra sequence that pays off now, where Kyo bribes Tomoyo to take the boar home in exchange for food. He fails as Botan runs off ahead of him, then lies about it to Kyo in an attempt to stave off her committing actual murder. This all pays off, if you can even call it that, in one of the VN's more unnecessary sequences, where after coldly ditching Nagisa at the basketball court, Okazuki returns to Sunahara's room, before he once again feels worried and checks in with the Furukawas where he learns Nagisa never returned home. Finally feeling some tiny twinge of guilt in his Grinch-like heart, Okazuki heads to school, passing by a young boy searching for his lost dog as he does so. Okazuki doesn't find Nagisa, but he does find the dog and the boy again, whereupon the kid explains a girl, clearly Nagisa, offered to help him. Okazuki tells the kid to run home and waits for Nagisa. Eventually she shows up, becoming even more crushed to learn the dog she thought she found was actually poor little Botan, driving home the point that she can't do anything right to help. To be honest, I don't understand why this extended sequence exists. It only serves to undercut the gut punch of Tomoyo revealing his injury with random nonsense, especially since we never even follow up about returning Botan and learning if Nagisa did indeed save Okazuki's life from Kyo's induced manslaughter. In the VN, we then see the illusionary world again, with an interesting sequence the anime only adapts way out at the end of Fuko arc, where the girl confirms the ball of lights are the only thing about the illusionary world the robot hadn't encountered in his past existence. We then begin the next day with Okazuki stopping by the bakery to ask about Nagisa. Despite Akio's harassment, he's able to confirm she's mostly fine, with just a slight fever. In the anime, we also get an interesting first sighting of Ibuki, Fuko's sister, who arrives at the bakery after Akio and Sane run out on one of their skits. This prompts Okazuki to dump the bread he received as thanks onto her. A similar sequence does show up later in a couple of the VN's routes, but all of those are much more in-depth, which makes it weird the anime chose to add it here, especially considering Okazuki doesn't even get her name or learn who she is in this encounter. Then, coming into sync, we finally get a side quest that takes place at exactly the same point in both versions with the introduction of Yoshino. This begins when a random passerby calls out to Okazuki during his daily commute to Sunahara's dorm, although in the VN of course there's the choice to ignore him and skip this sequence entirely. If you go along with it, you get dragged into an argument between the man who called Tomoyo over and a nearby electrician. The man claims that the electrician dropped something while working and damaged his car. This electrician is Yoshino, and after he dispenses some Yoshinoisms, Okazuki somehow recognizes the dent on the man's car was caused by a cat. That's where this encounter ends in the anime, but it's extended in the VN with Yoshino admitting he's behind schedule, and making the legally questionable decision to recruit Okazuki's help, which of course you can agree to or refuse. If you agree, Okazuki works for a few hours, and then gets paid for Yoshino for his assistance. Considering we're not even halfway through Nagisa's route yet, there's two notable setups here for important moments in Afterstory. During the work, Okazuki notes how exhausted he is, as well as noting that based on the pay he received for his temporary work, a full-time gig like Yoshino's would allow him to live alone, independent from his father. This clearly sets up for Afterstory, where Okazuki does go to Yoshino for a job, and both the work's toll on his body, as well as being able to live independently, are huge focuses of the story. There's also a moment in the VM where Yoshino mentions he's working to install new streetlights on this previously unlit road. This brings out a pang of resentment in Okazuki that he doesn't fully understand, as he considers the thought of the town changing around him, even in a clearly positive way. This fear is one of the driving forces throughout Afterstory, and compared to Okazuki's callous thoughts in the intro about bulldozing the hill on the way to school, this change of opinion shows how much Nagisa's influence has already been affecting him. Either way, the anime picks back up at Sunahara's dorm, where Suno explains that the electrician Okazuki met is actually a famous rock star who disappeared after some drama, and he is flabbergasted to learn that he's living in this town. Suno then plays a mixtape of Yoshino's music he received from his sister, which is the first time both the viewer and Okazuki learn that Suno has a sister, leading to Okazuki fantasizing about how monstrous she must be if she's related to Sunahara. That's where it ends in the anime, but once again the sequence continues in the VN, although this time the cut content is a lot less interesting. In this sequence, Okazuki goes a little too far and wipes Sunahara's precious mixtape, and then becomes weirdly obsessed with getting Sunahara to find Yoshino and get his autograph as a replacement. They do indeed find him, with Sunahara setting up the lie that he and Okazuki are in a band. This of course fails horribly, with Sunahara never actually working up the courage to admit he knows who Yoshino is, or to ask for the autograph, but Yoshino plays along and actually helps give Sunahara pointers on how to play guitar. But with this Yoshino posting aside, we then return to the main plot, with Okazuki returning to school in both versions where he sees Nagisa again eating alone in the courtyard. In a particularly cruel move, this is, as far as I can tell, the final chance to bail on Nagisa route in the VN and pursue another girl, ditching her permanently because it'd just be too awkward to patch things up, thus leaving her forever ostracized from her crush and only friend at school due to her botched attempt to show her gratitude for his help. But unlike VN Okazuki, you're not a total dick, so you don't choose that choice, and in both versions Nagisa sees Okazuki watching and finally works up the courage to wave at him. Okazuki ditches Suno and runs down, where Nagisa breaks into tears sobbing. Okazuki makes the weird but supportive move to grab her tear-soaked bread and eat it, which is like probably symbolic or something. They then bond over their shared idiocy and lack of ambition. They're just two people, living life, far removed from the concerns of important people or affairs. This is also where the anime chooses to have Tomoyo tell Nagisa to find him when she feels like crying, a moment that seems even more appropriate than in the VN. Fuko then shows up in the anime to steal her knife back as previously described, and gives Okazuki a star in return. In the VN, we instead get an unadapted Fuko sequence, where Fuko ditches a stolen wooden block on Okazuki as she's pursued by its original owners. Okazuki scares them off and they confront him as the thief, before Fuko returns and we get our first Fuko prank opportunity, trying to squirt apple juice up her nose. Pranking Fuko is a recurring gag in both versions, but it's practically a minigame in the VN, with different pranks you level up by repeating them on Fuko multiple times as she spaces out. Our next big plot point is Okazuki realizing the drama club recruitment posters they put up have been taken down, but first it's the anime's chance to catch up on some of the random BS that's already taken place in the VN. First we get Okazuki seeing Botan, followed by the anime's introduction to Yukine, the reference room librarian. This time, instead of Okazuki just randomly running into her, he's talking with Nagisa about the drama club info session, but for some reason they're in the rec room, whereupon Yukine plays the Uno reverse card and just randomly walks in on them. We basically get the same intro as in the VN, with Okazuki jokingly asking for coffee, to which Yukine surprisingly provides. As a side note, it seems like a deliberate choice in the anime to add Nagisa's presence for both Fuko and Yukine's introduction. Not only does it make her a little more involved as a character, it sends a clear message out about who's the main girl here. There's also an interesting comment anime Okazuki makes here, mentioning how the school, no, the entire town is filled with unique people. We then cut to Nagisa practicing her speech in the actual club room, and get Okazuki asking questions. In either case, this is where Okazuki notices the recruitment posters are torn down. The anime makes a smooth inclusion of a side character here, and has Yukine walking by to explain that the posters have been taken down by the council because they hadn't been approved. In either version, the scene ends with a PA announcement that would chill the bones of any student. Please come to the principal's office. Or in this case, it's technically, come to the student council office, since Japan is weird. The actual confrontation is played off screen in the anime, but in the VN we get to see the entire thing play out, starting with Okazuki pulling a weird comedy routine and forcing Nagisa to buy a shit ton of this vending machine bread as a bribe for the student council before she reports to their office. This fails to work, and you have the option to send Nagisa back in to argue her face, or to confront the student council president yourself. Regardless, you fail, with the stone-faced student council president outright refusing to talk to Okazuki as he's not actually a club member. There's also a heartbreaking moment where if you force Nagisa to go back in too many times, you find her standing frozen in front of the office door, her resolve broken, unable to take that first step up the hill. In either case, we resolve back at the club room with Okazuki and Nagisa discussing strategy. Their cuck anime versions discuss how to work around the student council's rules, while their Chad VN incarnations decide to ignore the council's stupid-ass rules and to put up more posters anyways, with Okazuki declaring they're both already delinquents anyways. In the anime, we also see Sunahara overhearing Tomoyo telling Nagisa to not give up and to keep trying, setting up his upcoming confrontation. They break for the day, and this is also where in the VN, Tomoyo and Sunahara meet back up with Yoshino to absolutely fail playing as a band in front of him. In both versions, we then get Sunahara asking if Okazuki is going out with Nagisa, to which Okazuki deflects by suggesting that he's just in it for the bread from her family's bakery, and in doing so, inadvertently convinces Sunahara to get in on this bread scheme as well. The next morning, we get another walk up the hill with Okazuki and Nagisa, at least we do in the VN. Once again, Okazuki has actually gotten up on time because he doesn't want Nagisa to be waiting for him. If you talk to Tomoyo enough, you can actually run into her, gazing at the sakura trees, and ask her about allowing the drama club to be set up. Tomoyo explains even if she is elected, it won't be until much later, and she's plainly disappointed when she realizes Okazuki is asking for Nagisa's sake. She does have a cute moment with Nagisa though, where they bond over their shared goals of getting elected and reforming the drama club respectively. Next up is Suno joining the drama club gang, but first the anime has to catch up some more of the random BS it skipped over earlier. We get a Tomoyo sandwich of Tsunohara trying to trick Tomoyo into revealing she's a boy, with an additional Fuko scene in between them from later on in the VN when Fuko runs into both Okazuki and Tsunohara, before trying to get Okazuki to thank her for the star, as well as explaining the situation around her sister's marriage. We're leaning pretty heavily into Fuko route here in the anime, while in the VN, Fuko's still pretty much in the background at this point, with the focus squarely on figuring out how to reform the drama club. On the other hand, Tomoyo's route is pretty clearly locked out at this point in the VN, especially considering she's already seen Okazuki together with Nagisa, while the anime is still working its way through her and Tsunohara's initial confrontations. It's at this point in the anime that Okazuki reveals Tsuno's messing with her because he suspects she's Okai. Like in the VN, she's disappointed to learn this, but doesn't pull Okazuki away to grope her as proof like in the VN. In either case, we return to the drama club room, where Tomoyo and Nagisa are trying to figure out their next steps. In the VN, this centers around wanting to print more posters in flagrant violation of the student council, but not having any left to make copies of. This is where Tsunohara heroically arrives, poster in hand, an interest made less heroic in the anime where the idea of reprinting the posters never came up, meaning he just arrives to kind of help out, I guess. It's a moot point though, as Nagisa decides she can't see any more of her cute Dango posters be cruelly torn down, which means they have to come up with a different strategy. Tsunohara of course suggests violence, which is immediately vetoed by the Nagisa block, before they decide to go ask someone else for more info. In the anime, Tsunohara at least gets to make the suggestion, meaning that despite his less impactful entrance, he does technically get to contribute something. In the VN, your options are to ask Fuko, which of course Okazuki immediately rejects before vocalizing it, his homeroom teacher, or, the choice both the anime and 99.5% of players chose, Ro, since she is technically a class president. But there's a complication. She's with her much more violent older sister. In the VN, she's just in class, while in the anime we get a Botan cameo as again the sisters are trying to send him home. In either case, the genius plan is concocted to have Tsunohara make it seem like a boy has a love confession for Ro, guaranteeing she'll go out alone and be ambushed by Nagisa, who's also none the wiser to the scheme. She goes, and with an occasional guiding comment from Tsunohara and Okazuki, is tricked into thinking Nagisa's about to ask her out, before being hit with the most romantic of lines. "Will you help me reform the drama club?" This leads to an eavesdropping Kyo revealing herself, and laying the hurt down on Okazuki and Tsunohara. In the VN, the rest of the girls in Ryo's class are also revealed to have been listening in on the potential confession. In both versions, Ryo actually says yes to Nagisa's questions before she realizes Nagisa isn't actually asking her out, making Ro the only romanceable character to have not one, but two or potentially even three other characters she at least agrees to go out with. She also happens to be the only main girl without an official route. Is there a correlation there? Were the devs trying to punish poor Ro for being loose? Well, let's just say it's a conversation for much, much later. This is also another opportunity to praise the anime for how well it improves the framing of these scenes, with the gang hanging out in the club room, Kyo watching over the penitent pranksters as Ro explains the rules for forming a club, instead of the conversation happening entirely in the hallway as in the VN. Either way, Ro gives us the series' next main goal, although it's a little different in each version. In the anime, their goal is to gather 3 members so the drama club can be officially formed, while in the VN, they quickly overcome this hurdle by having Okazuki and Tsunohara agree to at least lie about their club participation. However, they learn they also need to recruit an advisor to make the club official. We'll shortly see the reason for this subtle change on the anime's part, but first an anime-only cutaway where Kyo asks if Okazuki is going out with Nagisa, which makes sense given her character. He denies it of course, but it does start to form a proper group dynamic, instead of the VN where Kyo and Ro are total side characters in Nagisa's route and pretty quickly drop out of the narrative after this. In the anime, we then jump to Tsunohara and Okazuki in the dorms, discussing Tsunohara's final plan to seduce Tomoyo, which I discussed earlier in the VN. This plays out similarly, although the anime never provides any real finality to Tsunohara's antics here. There's no reconciliation between Tomoyo and Okazuki. In the VN, she admits at this point that she has been a little nostalgic playing around with him, a reference to her own delinquent past, and she later thanks Okazuki for finally putting a stop to Tsunohara's scheming, admitting that he actually is a genuine guy. Instead in the anime, we get Okazuki asking Tomoyo if she wants to join the drama club, which she turns down, while giving some background into her desire to be elected student president. The anime keeps Tsunohara's censor face beaten to a pulp at least. We then get another scene unique to the anime where Okazuki tries and fails to recruit Kotomi to the drama club. This references one of Kotomi Route's later meetings in a small way, with Okazuki unable to get Kotomi's attention unless he refers to her as Kotomi-chan. Anime Okazuki then touches base with Nagisa to report their failure to recruit new members, and Tomoyo decides to try asking Fuko. And that's where this comparison gets complicated, as the anime uses this unique searching for club members premise to smoothly slide into Fuko arc. This is unlike the VN, which continues on Nagisa route for a while before you're ever even given the chance to split off onto Fuko route. This does mean there's a handful of significant Nagisa route events that occur previously to Fuko route in the VN, which simply haven't happened yet in the anime's continuity as it kicks off onto Fuko's storyline. This makes comparisons a little difficult, as I don't want to go over the remaining content in Nagisa arc yet, considering the anime doesn't pick it back up until episode 16, a full 12 episodes later. On the other hand, discussing Fuko route is also a more straightforward comparison, since the shuffling around of common route events has more or less ended by this point in the VN, now that we're locked into a proper route. And speaking of shuffling things around, this is also where the anime's more blatant adjustments to the VN's timelines begin, as Nagisa's route has to be stretched wide to accommodate the coming events from other routes stuffed dead in the middle of its narrative. So what's next for this comparison? Well, we're going to follow the anime's lead and leave Nagisa route for now, ending with Okazuki and Nagisa failing to find enough members to recruit for the drama club. We'll also handwave the event skipped over between here and the start of Fuko route in the VN, and just jump into discussing that arc. I might have to bring up some details so that the VN's continuity makes sense, but we'll catch right back up on most of the skipped content when the anime eventually circles back, although that might be a while. So before I leave off, let's just review what we've seen. I'll save a full analysis of the differences for the end of Nagisa arc, but for now we've seen much of the same content in both versions, just shuffled around differently, as well as some of the expected cuts to day-to-day mundanity of the VN. Overall, I can see why the VN's calendar-based structure could be seen as padding, but I ended up really enjoying it as a framing device. It does begin to disappear later on during the plot-heavy conclusions of most routes, but it does structurally support Okazuki's arc. We see him lazing through each day, stuck in a repetitive cycle that slowly transitions into the content of the route as Okazuki begins to find things and people he can actually care about and become invested in, instead of reliving the same events over day after day after day. The anime's structure, of course, loses this nuance, and much of this reshuffling is necessary to fit into the episodic format, making sure there's some sort of climax or cliffhanger every 20 minutes or so. Of course, this transition was inevitable, but I think one of the biggest casualties of this approach is the beginning of Nagisa route, which feels oddly rushed in the anime. I mean, instead of slowly developing the relationship like in the VN, Okazuki visits Nagisa's house after basically only a single day of knowing her. This also ties into the fact that there's a couple noticeable themes and ideas the VN sets up that the anime just doesn't seem as interested in exploring, focusing instead on checking off plot points as quickly as possible during these early episodes. For example, there's a lot of small character moments cut from the VN that focus on Okazuki and Nagisa's loneliness as outsiders. This helps give a flavor to the relationship that's just missing in the anime. I don't know if these are character beats the anime just didn't feel it had time to explore, or if there is some intentional reason they chose to ignore these characteristics, because the anime does make some seemingly intentional changes to the characters I can respect. For example, Okazuki and Tsunohara are less legitimately cruel, and Nagisa is less unbelievably brain-dead compared to the VN. In a lot of ways I like these changes, since it tones down the over-the-top early 2000s anime-ishness of these characteristics, and makes them appear more relatable and believable. But by the same coin you could argue it also makes their personalities less distinct. But outside these details, I think the anime brings a fantastic and well-planned adaptive energy to the narrative. It brings in many of the side characters early, and gives them small additional roles to keep them relevant, even if it does sometimes feel a little on the nose. It's also nice Nagisa's presence is added to a lot of the side scenes, even if she doesn't really contribute anything in them. It makes her appear as much more of an equal to Okazuki, compared to the VN where of course Okazuki as the player avatar is the only one meeting the wider cast and going all these side adventures during Common Route. I also can't overemphasize how much life the anime's visual direction gives to the characters in town. KyoAni really hasn't become a visual powerhouse at this point, although that transition definitely has occurred by the time the second season starts, but their creative addition of small character moments or unique locations does a ton to make the plot feel less artificial, something that's unfortunately somewhat inherent to the VN's small set of backgrounds and character art that it's forced to recycle again and again. And, well, that's it for this first part of my grand Clannad comparison. All that discussion and we haven't even gotten to the heart of Nagisa route. As mentioned, the next episode will be a nice self-contained dissection that covers all of Fuko route, which is arguably the side route most thoroughly adapted by the anime. But does the anime mess it up? What shenanigans did the production staff pull to have the narrative continue after the end of this arc, when in the VN the credits would be rolling? And why does the anime hate student-teacher relationships? Tune in next time to find out.